Miss Marple inclined her head. Very sensible. It was perhaps half an hour before Constable Grant arrived, accompanied shortly after by Inspector Crail from Much Benham. Grant was a fresh-faced young man, eager but inexperienced, while Inspector Crail was older, dour and methodical. He wasted no time in establishing order. Questioning the guests with brisk efficiency, Dr. Brentwood's body was examined where it lay. The inspector crouched beside him, his expression grave. No wound or injury. But there are signs here, he gestured discreetly, of asphyxiation. Poison, perhaps. We shall need the county pathologist. The guests gasped anew. Poison. The very word carried a sinister chill. Now then, Crail continued, rising, I must ask, did Dr. Brentwood eat or drink anything unusual? It was Mrs. Harroway who spoke first, her voice unsteady. He had tea, of course, like us all, and the first frost of November had settled delicately across the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, sparkling like powdered sugar on the thorny brambles. From the steeple of St. Mary's Church, a bell tolled 8, sending the sound rolling across the quiet village. At this hour, most of the inhabitants were engaged in their morning routines, shopkeepers opening shutters, gardeners sweeping away brittle leaves, and the postman trundling dutifully along the lane on his bicycle. At the end of the High Street, with its small tea shop and butcher's window filled with pheasants, there stood the modest yet distinguished Gossington Hall. Though its great days of society, balls and carriages had long passed, the hall retained an air of faded grandeur. Its current mistress, Mrs. Clementine Harroway, had revived some of the household sparkle by hosting frequent teas and inviting the ladies of the Women's Institute to make use of the drawing-room for their meetings. It was here, on that frosty morning, that Miss Jane Marple was to attend a gathering, though she might have admitted, had anyone asked, that she went more out of curiosity than necessity. Miss Marple, with her soft white hair and piercing blue eyes, had a way of observing that often unsettled the unsuspecting. One might think her a harmless old lady with her knitting and her gentle manners, but those who underestimated her rarely did so twice. The occasion was a recipe exchange tea, an idea of Mrs. Harroway's, who was determined to cultivate a reputation as a hostess of refinement. Each guest was to bring some home-baked contribution, along with a recipe to be copied and shared. Miss Marple had brought a small tin of seed cake, an old family recipe that had never failed. Her aunt had arrived precisely on time. She was shown into the drawing-room by the maid, where a fire crackled cheerfully, and the air already carried the scent of cinnamon, nutmeg, and freshly baked bread. Mrs. Clementine Harroway, the hostess, a woman in her early 60s, elegant yet somewhat imperious. She wore pearls, and spoke with a faintly condescending air, as though she were bestowing favours merely by conversing. Dr. Lionel Brentwood, the village physician, tall, broad-shouldered, with an affable manner. He was a widower of 10 years, and known for his fondness for sweet puddings. Mrs. Edith Larkin, the vicar's wife, earnest and rather flittery, who was forever busying herself with parish concerns and charitable projects. Mr. Julian Deverell, a retired colonel, his moustache bristling like a broom. He was prone to telling long stories of his time in India. Whether invited or not, Miss Lucy Harroway, Mrs. Harroway's niece, a young woman of about 26, spirited and clever, who had come to live at Gossington Hall after the sudden death of her parents. Mr. Harold Pritchard, a local solicitor, middle-aged, neat, and fastidious, who had represented many families in the county and was known for his discretion. On the long oak table lay an impressive spread of cakes, biscuits, and pastries. Among these stood a plate of cinnamon biscuits, arranged neatly in concentric circles. Their golden-brown surfaces sparkled faintly with sugar, and the aroma of spice was almost intoxicating. "It is my own recipe," Mrs. Harroway announced proudly as the guests admired them. "A touch of orange zest with the cinnamon. One must always have a signature bake, I believe." Miss Marple, who had taken a seat in the corner armchair, smiled politely and thought to herself that signature bakes often carried with them signature egos. She declined a biscuit at first, preferring a slice of seed cake with her tea, but she noted that nearly everyone else eagerly accepted one. The conversation meandered pleasantly enough. Recipes, the difficulty of obtaining proper ingredients. These days, Colonel Deverell's endless anecdotes about Berwick's life. Yet beneath the surface, Miss Marple detected currents of unease. She observed how Mr. Pritchard, for instance, seemed to avoid Lucy Harroway's gaze, or how Lucy herself grew tense whenever her aunt spoke sharply. small things, but to Miss Marple, such details often hinted at larger stories. It was not until an hour later, after much tea had been poured and laughter exchanged, that the incident occurred. Dr. Brentwood, who had been enjoying his second cinnamon biscuit, suddenly went pale. His hand clutched at his throat, his eyes widened, and he sank heavily back in his chair. The room froze, then erupted into cries of alarm. "Doctor!" exclaimed Mrs. Larkin, rushing forward. "Oh heavens, what's happening?" Lucy gave a small scream, while Colonel Deverell called for someone to fetch water. Mrs. Harroway stood rigid, her hand to her mouth, staring at the fallen physician. But Miss Marple did not rush. She set down her teacup with precision and leaned forward, her gaze fixed upon Dr. Brentwood. His face had taken on a bluish tinge. His breathing was labored, and his movements weakened until he lay still. It was Mr. Pritchard who finally said, in a strained voice, He's gone." There was silence then, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Mrs. Larkin began to weep softly. Lucy looked faint, gripping the back of a chair. Mrs. Harroway muttered, "Impossible. Utterly impossible." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap, the only sound she herself permitted to make. Inside, however, her mind was already worried. She had seen enough in her long life to recognize the signs. Dr. Brentwood had not died of natural causes. Something in those cinnamon biscuits, or at least in the one he had eaten, had carried death with it. And that, Miss Marple reflected, was very curious indeed. The drawing-room of Gossington Hall, once filled with the warm scents of cinnamon and tea, now seemed cloaked in an icy pall. The fire still glowed in the grate, but it no longer gave comfort. The 7 living guests sat or stood in stunned silence, staring at the still form of Dr. Lionel Brentwood, sprawled awkwardly in the high-backed chair. It was Miss Jane Marple who finally broke the silence, her voice calm, almost conversational. "I think," she said gently, "that we must send for the constable." Her words seemed to rouse the company from their trance. Colonel Deverell puffed out his chest, eager to take command. Quite right, Miss Marple, leave it to me. I'll telephone the station at once." But Mrs. Harroway, still pale and shaken, placed a trembling hand on his arm. "The telephone is in the morning room, Colonel, down the passage, first door on the left." The Colonel strode out with military briskness, and in the heavy silence that followed, Miss Marple's eyes wandered discreetly about the room. Lucy Harroway still stood, her hand clutching the chair, her gaze flickering nervously from her aunt to the dead man. Mrs. Larkin was dabbing her eyes, murmuring prayers under her breath. Mr. Pritchard sat stiff and silent, his hands clasped so tightly together that his knuckles whitened. When the Colonel returned, he announced, "Constable Grant is on his way, and I said he should fetch the inspector from Much Benham as well. A matter such as this requires official handling. Oh, of my cinnamon biscuits, my own recipe. But surely, you don't mean—" She trailed off, her eyes wide with horror. "We'll not jump to conclusions, madame," the inspector said sternly, "but the possibility cannot be ignored." At this, Lucy Harroway cried out, "Oh, Aunt Clem, what if someone tampered with them?" The inspector turned his attention to her. "You baked these yourself?" "Yes, of course," Mrs. Harroway replied, drawing herself up with a shred of her usual hauteur. "This very morning, I made them in the kitchen myself. Cook prepared the other things, but the biscuits were my contribution." Miss Marple, who had sat quietly with her knitting, spoke up in her mild voice. "You will forgive me for observing, Mrs. Harroway, but I dare say cook or the maid might have had access to them before they were served." Mrs. Harroway pursed her lips. "Perhaps, though I placed them on the table with my own hands." Inspector Crail nodded. "We'll examine the kitchen, of course. In the meantime, I should like each of you to give an account of yourselves, where you sat, what you ate, and whether you noticed anything unusual." Thus began the long process of questioning, during which Miss Marple, though not directly involved, listened with the keenest attention. The guests, Count Colonel Deverell declared robustly that he had eaten 1 cinnamon biscuit. Capital thing, quite the taste of the Rog about it, and felt perfectly well. He sat opposite Dr. Brentwood and noticed nothing amiss until the doctor suddenly collapsed. Mrs. Larkin, weeping gently, confessed she had taken only a slice of seed cake, Miss Marple's seed cake. In fact, Tand avoided the biscuits, claiming cinnamon gave her indigestion. She had been beside Lucy and had seen Dr. Brentwood take 2, maybe 3 biscuits, though she could not be certain. Mr. admitted to trying one biscuit, but said he found it a little too sweet for my taste. He had been deep in conversation with Colonel Deverell at the time of the incident and did not notice Dr. Brentwood's distress until it was too late. Lucy Harroway said she had not eaten any biscuits at all. She had been preparing to leave early, as she was expecting a visitor at the hall later that afternoon, though she seemed reluctant to explain who Mrs. Harroway, of course, had eaten none of her own biscuits. She explained this loftily by saying she had already sampled them in the kitchen. Miss Marple, when asked, reported truthfully that she had declined the biscuits, having preferred her seed cake. She added in her quiet way, "It seemed to me, Inspector, that Dr. Brentwood reached for them rather eagerly, almost as though he favored them above everything else." Inspector Crail grunted. "And do you recall, Miss Marple, whether his portion came from the same plate as the rest?" "Oh yes," Miss Marple replied, her needles clicking. "He served himself from the plate nearest him. I could not help but notice how he selected one from the center of the circle, and later another from the side." Tensions emerged, the inspector continued. Miss Marple allowed her mind to wander over what she had observed. Dr. Brentwood had been popular enough, but popularity, she knew, often concealed undercurrents of resentment on Mrs. Harroway. For instance, had often clashed with the doctor over the fees he charged. More than once, Miss Marple had overheard her complain that Brentwood thinks himself a Harley Street specialist when he's nothing more than a country doctor. Lucy Harroway seemed nervous, almost guilty. Her avoidance of the biscuits might have been coincidence, or it might have been foresight, and her reluctance to explain her expected visitor suggested a secret. Mr. Pritchard was cool, almost detached, but Miss Marple recalled hearing, through village whispers, that he and the doctor had recently argued over the handling of a will. Mrs. Larkin had less obvious cause for enmity, yet the vicar's wife was not above small jealousies. Dr. Brentwood had, after all, been a widower, and there had been some suggestion, though always discreet, that she had shown him a little more attention than propriety allowed. As for Colonel Deverell, he had always spoken warmly of the doctor, yet Miss Marple knew from experience that military men often harbored grievances invisible to others. The inspectors progressed by the time the pathologist's team arrived to take the body away. The drawing room was heavy with dread and speculation. The inspector ordered that no one was to leave until the kitchen had been searched and statements taken. When the biscuits were examined, 3 remained untouched on the plate. These, along with crumbs collected from Dr. Brentwood's chair, were carefully sealed for testing. The inspector seemed convinced that poison had been introduced deliberately into the batch. Yet Miss Marple, observing from her corner, felt a gentle tug of doubt. If all the biscuits had been poisoned, why had only Dr. Brentwood suffered? Others had eaten them without harm. No, she thought, it was not so simple. She cast her mind back to Dr. Brentwood himself, his eager hand reaching for the biscuits, his evident enjoyment. Could it be that only certain biscuits had been tainted, or even only one? Her thoughts were interrupted by Lucy, who suddenly rose from her chair, her face pale. "Inspector," she said, "I must speak with you privately." Crail gave her a sharp look but nodded. The two left the room, and for several minutes the others sat in uneasy silence. Miss Marple's needles clicked. She reflected that when young ladies asked to speak privately, it usually meant they had something to conceal rather than to reveal. A village in shock by evening. The news had spread throughout St. Mary Mead. Villagers whispered outside the post office, in the lanes, and over garden fences. Poisoned. In Mrs. Harroway's drawing room, of all places. At the vicarage, Mrs. Larkin was comforted by her husband. At the inn, Colonel Deverell loudly declared it must be the work of foreign agents. Mr. Pritchard returned to his office, refusing to answer questions from curious clients, and at her own neat cottage on the lane, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting set aside, and thought deeply. She recalled Dr. Brentwood's hands, steady, capable, the hands of a physician, yet he had grasped at his throat like any common man. The irony struck her. She also thought of the cinnamon biscuits, golden, sugared, seemingly harmless, a clever medium for poison, yes, but also a symbol. For what was a biscuit but a thing of comfort, of trust? To turn it into a weapon was a particularly cruel inversion. As the clock struck 9, Miss Marple nodded to herself. She would, of course, say nothing yet, but she had already noticed small things, trifles that others might dismiss, which she believed would, in time, prove telling. For Miss Marple knew human nature, and in St. Mary Mead, as anywhere, Human nature was the key to murder. The following morning dawned grey and damp, with a mist clinging stubbornly to the hedgerow. At Gossington Hall, Inspector Crail had established a kind of command post, with Constable Grant stationed at the door, and the household under instructions not to leave. Miss Marple, as was her habit, had gone about her morning quietly, tending to her geraniums before venturing up to the hall once more. She was, after all, a neighbour, and a neighbour, in her experience, was often less resented in times of crisis than an officer of the law. The inspector's frustration when she arrived. She found Inspector Crail in the morning room, his brow furrowed, his manner short. He greeted her politely, but with an air of impatience. "Poisoning confirmed," he said without preamble. "Arsenic. Enough in the doctor's system to fell a horse." The biscuits were tainted. Miss Marple's eyes widened ever so slightly. "All of them?" Inspector Crail scowled. "No, that's the devil of it. The 3 that remained were tested and found harmless, which means only 1 or 2 were poisoned. Targeted, deliberate." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "That suggests, does it not, that someone meant specifically for poor Dr. Brentwood to have them?" Crail gave a grunt. "Precisely, which means our culprit must have known his habits. Did he always favour cinnamon biscuits?" "Oh yes," Miss Marple said softly. "He was quite fond of them. I recall him telling Mrs. Larkin at the fete last summer that cinnamon was his weakness." The inspector began pacing. Then whoever did this counted on that fondness. But how was the poison introduced? If Mrs. Harroway baked the biscuits herself, he trailed off, his frown deepening. Unless she herself. Miss Marple raised a hand gently. "Forgive me, Inspector, but Mrs. Harroway strikes me as a woman much concerned with appearances. Poisoning a guest at her own tea party seems untidy, and she is too proud a hostess to endure such a scandal willingly." Crail gave her a sharp look, as if reluctant to admit her reasoning carried weight. "We'll see, we'll see." Lucy's secret visitor. It was later that morning that Lucy Harroway's secret came to light. Constable Grant, eager to prove himself, reported that a young man had been seen loitering near the hall yesterday, shortly before the fatal tea. Inspector Crail wasted no time in summoning Lucy. She entered the morning room pale but defiant, her hands clasped before her. "Yes," she admitted. "I was expecting Mr. Peter Ellison. He's an architect in Much Benham. We've been acquainted for some months. I wanted Aunt Clem to meet him." Mrs. Harroway, who sat nearby, stiffened. "Acquainted? You mean carrying on behind my back?" Lucy flushed. "There was nothing improper. But I knew you disapproved, Aunt, and I feared you would forbid it. That is why I said nothing." Crail eyed her keenly. "And what connection, if any, had Mr. Ellison with Dr. Brentwood?" Lucy shook her head. "None that I know of. Why should there be?" Miss Marple, however, observed the faint quiver in her voice. Young ladies rarely confessed all at once. There was more to this acquaintance with the architect than Lucy wished to reveal. Colonel de Verrill's bluster that afternoon. Colonel de Verrill was in high form, striding about the drawing-room like a caged tiger. "Damned underhanded business. Poisoning," he bellowed. "Coward's weapon. In India, we knew the type daggers in the dark, powders in the wine. Never face to face like an Englishman." Miss Marple regarded him mildly. "And yet, Colonel, one might argue that poison requires a certain boldness. To sit calmly in company, knowing death is passing from hand to hand." The Colonel "Well, it wasn't me, madam. Brentwood was a good fellow. Saved my life once. You know, when I had a touch of fever, prescribed quinine, saw me through. I owed him a debt." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Debts, Colonel, are curious things. Sometimes they inspire gratitude, sometimes resentment." He looked startled, then laughed gruffly. "By Jove, you've a sharp tongue for a lady with knitting needles." The solicitor's slip. It was toward evening when a new thread emerged. Miss Marple had taken her place by the window, quietly observing. When she overheard Mr. Pritchard speaking with Inspector Crail, "It is true," the solicitor admitted reluctantly, "that I had business dealings with Dr. Brentwood, a matter of a will, but I fail to see how it is relevant." "Whose will?" Crail pressed. "That of the late Mr. Harroway, Mrs. Clementine's husband. Dr. Brentwood was one of the witnesses. You see, there was some dispute over a perfectly ordinary in legal practice." Miss Marple pricked up her ears. Wills were seldom ordinary. They had a way of stirring deep emotions, awakening resentments, and unearthing secrets thought long buried. She glanced at Mrs. Harroway, who had stiffened at the mention of her late husband. Her lips pressed tightly together, and she offered no comment. A A strange discovery it was 2 days later, as the inquest loomed, that another twist occurred. The maid at Gossington Hall, a timid girl named Alice, came forward trembling. "Please, sir," she told Inspector Crail, "I found this in the scullery bin. Thought it might be nothing, but well," Cook said, "I'd best tell you." She handed over a small brown paper packet, crumpled and stained with sugar dust. On the outside, in neat handwriting, were the words ground cinnamon. But when the inspector had it tested, it proved to contain not only cinnamon but traces of arsenic. The revelation caused uproar. Mrs. Harroway fainted outright. The colonel thundered about devilish tricks. Mrs. Larkin sobbed into her handkerchief. Lucy went white as chalk. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat very still, her eyes thoughtful. Poison mixed with cinnamon. Yes, that was clever. The strong spice would conceal both taste and smell. But who had placed the packet in the scullery bin? And why discard it so carelessly, as though wishing it to be found? A red herring suspicion now fell heavily upon the servants. Cook protested indignantly that she had never touched the cinnamon. The biscuits were baked by Mrs. Harroway herself. The maid, Alice, swore she had never seen the packet before, yet Inspector Crail seemed inclined to view the servants as likely culprits. "Common enough," he muttered, resentful of their betters, tempted by a bribe, or carrying on with someone who wished harm. Miss Marple disagreed. "Oh no, Inspector. Servants may grumble, but they seldom murder, not in this fashion. If they poison at all, it is with a mind to gain something, money perhaps, or freedom. But this is personal." Crail gave her a look of irritation. "You seem to know a good deal about it, Miss Marple." She smiled sweetly. "Only about human nature, Inspector, and human nature does not often change, whether in servants or in ladies of society." Another shock that night. As the household retired, another event shattered the uneasy calm. A cry echoed through the hall. Lucy's voice, shrill with terror. The others rushed to her room, where she stood clutching a note, her face ashen. The note, scrawled in a hurried hand, read, "Keep silent, or you will follow the doctor." Gasps filled the room. Colonel Deverell swore violently. Mrs. Larkin nearly collapsed. Mrs. Harroway clutched her niece's shoulders, demanding explanations. But Lucy could only sob, "I don't know who, I don't know why." Miss Marple took the note delicately, studying the handwriting. It was clumsy, almost disguised, but to her sharp eyes it carried hints a heavy hand. Letters formed of the soldier's bluntness, perhaps, or a solicitor's caution. She tucked the thought away quietly. Threats, in her experience, were seldom what they appeared. Sometimes they were warnings, sometimes they were meant to divert suspicion, and sometimes they were merely theatre. Miss Marple reflects back at her cottage the following day. Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting. She thought of Dr. Brentwood, respected, even liked, yet harbouring disputes with nearly everyone in that room. She thought of Lucy and her secret architect, of Pritchard and the disputed will, of Mrs. Harroway's pride, of Colonel Deverell's bluster, of Mrs. Larkin's nervous glances. Each had something to hide, though not all had reason to kill. And above all, she thought of the cinnamon biscuits, innocent in appearance, deadly in design. Someone had chosen that method carefully, knowing Dr. Brentwood's weakness, concealing the poison in sweetness. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. Yes, it was all very curious indeed, but she felt herself drawing closer, stitch by stitch, to the heart of the matter. For human nature, she reminded herself, was like a pattern in knitting, complex at first glance, but with repetition, one began to see the design, and the design, in this case, pointed unmistakably toward murder most deliberate. The days following the discovery of the arsenic packet passed under a shadow. Gossington Hall, usually a place of cultivated civility, had become a house of suspicion. Every glance was questioned, every word weighed. Inspector Crail continued his formal inquiries, but Miss Marple, unobtrusive in her corner, was making her own progress. A morning visit in, the third morning, Miss Marple called discreetly upon Mrs. Larkin at the Vic. The poor woman looked wan, her eyes rimmed with red from weeping. "I still cannot believe it," she said, pouring tea with trembling hands. "To think, Dr. Brentwood gone so suddenly, and in such a dreadful way." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "You were fond of him, were you not?" Mrs. Larkin flushed. "Fond? Well, he was always so kind to me, so attentive when I was ill. Not many men would take such trouble." Miss Marple regarded her gently. "It is never easy, my dear, to find oneself caring for a widower. People talk, of course, and sometimes if one feels disappointed." Tears welled in Mrs. Larkin's eyes. He had promised. She broke off, dabbing at her eyes. "Oh, but what am I saying? He was only a friend, only a friend." Miss Marple said nothing more, but as she walked home her thoughts were busy. Promises unkept often bred bitterness, and bitterness was a fertile soil for rash deeds. The Colonel's tale that afternoon. Miss Marple encountered Colonel Deverell in the High Street. He greeted her with hearty bluster, yet his eyes shifted uneasily. "Dashed nuisance, all this police nonsense," he grumbled, "treating us like suspects, as if a British officer would stoop to poison." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "And yet, Colonel Arsenic has been called the soldier's poison, easily obtainable. Once, in foreign climes." He stiffened. "I know nothing about that, madame." But after a pause, he added, "Still, I dare say Brentwood wasn't without enemies. Had some nasty rows over fees, didn't he? And over Mrs. Harroway's husband's will, I hear." Miss Marple tucked this away. It was curious how often people volunteered information they thought incriminated others, almost as if they sought to deflect suspicion. A clue in the kitchen later that evening. Miss Marple requested a quiet word with Alice, the maid. She found the girl in the kitchen, polishing silver with nervous energy. "You found the packet, did you not?" Miss Marple asked kindly. "Yes, Miss, in the bin, but I swear I never saw it before." "I believe you," Miss Marple said, "but tell me, when you cleared the tea things, did you notice whether all the plates were empty?" Alice frowned, thinking, "Now you mention it, Miss, Dr. Brentwood's saucer had crumbs on it, but Mr. Pritchard's plate still had half a biscuit. I took it to the scullery and threw it away." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly, "that is very interesting indeed." Lucy's confession the next morning. Lucy sought Miss Marple in private. Her eyes were shadowed, her voice low. I must tell someone. I can't bear it any longer." "My dear child," Miss Marple said gently, "sit down and tell me what troubles you." Lucy clasped her hands tightly. Mr. Ellison, he asked Dr. Brentwood for help. He wanted a reference to secure a commission for a new housing estate, but the doctor refused. He said Peter was unreliable, and Aunt Clem would never approve of him. We quarrelled bitterly about it." Miss Marple listened. "And you feared that if the inspector knew, suspicion might fall on Peter?" Lucy nodded miserably. "Yes, that's why I kept silent. But I swear, neither of us would ever." She broke off in tears. Miss Marple patted her hand. "There, secrets have a way of seeming worse than they are. You did right to tell me." But inwardly, she thought, the net was tightening. Too many people had reason to dislike Dr. Brentwood. Yet the method subtle deliberate did not speak of youthful passion or hysterical grief. It spoke of calculation. The solicitors erred that afternoon. Inspector Crail called the household together in the drawing-room. He announced grimly that the inquest was set for the following week, and that evidence pointed clearly to arsenic administered in the biscuits. At this, Mr. Pritchard cleared his throat. "Might I point out, Inspector, that arsenic could be obtained quite innocently. Rat poison, for instance. Any household might have it." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Indeed, Mr. Pritchard, though it is curious, is it not, that one should use cinnamon to conceal the taste? That requires forethought and some knowledge of the victim's particular fondness." Pritchard coloured slightly. "You suggest I knew his tastes? Preposterous." "Not preposterous at all," Miss Marple said mildly, "for as his solicitor, you would have seen him often. And I recall, at the fete, you yourself fetched him a cinnamon bun." There was a silence. Pritchard opened his mouth, closed it again, and adjusted his spectacles. "I hardly recall the occasion." Miss Marple's needles clicked. She did not press further. The time for pressing would come later. A late-night thought that night. Alone in her cottage, Miss Marple considered the matter anew. The poisoned biscuits, only 1 or 2 tainted, the rest harmless. That meant the killer must have added the poison after baking, perhaps dusting it on or injecting it subtly. The packet in the bin, too obvious, almost certainly a red herring, placed to divert suspicion. Lucy's note of warning, another diversion. The real killer, Miss Marple felt sure, had no need of threats. The guilty rarely drew attention to themselves. And then there was the will, a disputed codicil, witnessed by Dr. Brentwood. Wills were dangerous documents. People had killed for far less. Miss Marple laid aside her knitting and murmured, "Yes, I believe I see the pattern now, but it must be tested." The test the next morning, Miss Marple requested a small favour of Inspector Crail. With his reluctant consent, She arranged for the household to gather once more for tea in the drawing room. On the table was placed a fresh plate of Biscuit cinnamon biscuits, baked by cook under careful supervision. When all were seated, Miss Marple said gently, "We must not let fear prevent us from enjoying hospitality. Let us each take a biscuit." There was hesitation, then nervous compliance. Only Mr. Pritchard resisted, his lips tightening. "I have no appetite," he said coldly. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "How curious, for you had appetite enough, sir, on the day of the tragedy until you discovered the biscuits were dangerous. Then, suddenly, you had no taste for them at all." The room fell silent. Pritchard flushed crimson. "That proves nothing." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said softly, "it proves everything. You alone left half a biscuit uneaten. You alone had business quarrels with Dr. Brentwood over Mrs. Harroway's will. You alone knew his fondness for cinnamon and how to exploit it." Inspector Crail leaned forward. "Are you accusing Mr. Pritchard of murder?" Miss Marple folded her hands serenely. "I am not accusing, Inspector. I am observing, and my observation is that Mr. Pritchard had both motive and method. The poisoned biscuit was meant for Dr. Brentwood alone. The discarded packet of cinnamon was too convenient, too icily found. It was planted to mislead, and the threatening note to Lucy and other diversion." She paused, her blue eyes sharp. "Mr. Pritchard is a careful man, but even careful men make mistakes. His mistake was in thinking no one would notice which biscuit he left uneaten." All eyes turned to Pritchard. He opened his mouth, shut it, then sagged in his chair, his face ashen. Miss Marple's needles clicked once more. "It is all very simple. You see, human nature always is." The room was frozen in silence after Miss Marple's quiet pronouncement. The autumn wind rattled faintly at the windows of Gossington Hall, as though even nature held its breath. Mr. Pritchard sat slumped in the chintz armchair, his spectacles glinting in the lamplight, his lips moving but producing no sound. At last he spoke, a strained whisper. You cannot prove it." Inspector Crail leaned forward. "Is that a denial, sir?" Pritchard swallowed, his hands twisting in his lap. "It is merely an assertion. I had no reason to harm Brentwood. Our dealings were professional." Miss Marple raised one slender hand. "Forgive me, but that is not quite accurate, is it? You had every reason. Dr. Brentwood had discovered your little deception regarding Mrs. Harroway's estate." The others stirred, puzzled. Colonel Deverell frowned. Lucy gave a small gasp, and Mrs. Harroway herself stiffened in alarm. "Deception," the widow cried. "What does she mean, Mr. Pritchard?" Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, though each word struck like a hammer. "It was you, Mr. Pritchard, who drafted the codicil, claiming to grant Mrs. Harroway a reduced annuity, a document that conveniently diverted a handsome sum into a trust you controlled. Dr. Brentwood, as witness, began to suspect the truth. He intended to confront you and, if necessary, expose your dishonesty." Mr. Pritchard's face grew mottled. "Absurd." "Not absurd at all," Miss Marple said, "for the simplest proof lies in your behavior. You sought to silence him not by open quarrel, which would be remarked, but by the most discreet method. A little arsenic, concealed in a delicacy you knew he could not resist." "The cinnamon biscuit." "The method, Inspector," Crail interjected. "But how, Miss Marple?" "The biscuits were baked in quantity, and served alike to all." "Why did only Dr. Brentwood suffer?" "Because," Miss Marple explained, "the biscuits were altered after they were baked. Only 2 were tainted, one consumed by Dr. Brentwood, the other placed as decoy on Mr. Pritchard's plate. He nibbled at it, then contrived to leave half, thus ensuring suspicion might fall on another. Alice, the maid, flushed. I threw that one away, Miss." "Just as you said." "Quite so." Miss Marple nodded. "You were most observant, my dear." The diversions. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. The poisoned biscuit alone might not have been sufficient to mislead, so Mr. Pritchard created diversions. The discarded packet in the scullery too easily found, too obvious, and the anonymous note to Lucy a crude attempt to suggest some personal quarrel. In truth, the murderer is nearly always the one who provides such dramatic clues. Lucy's face turned pale. "Then Peter is innocent." "Entirely," Miss Marple said kindly. "Young love is foolish, perhaps, but not murderous." The motive. Miss Harroway rose abruptly, her eyes blazing. "Is this true, Mr. Pritchard? Did you meddle with my husband's will?" Pritchard sagged lower. "I only sought to protect the estate. Investments, debts, greed." Miss Marple corrected gently. "It is always greed, in one form or another." Inspector Crale's jaw tightened. "Mr. Pritchard, I must warn you, anything further you say may be used as evidence." For a moment, Pritchard seemed about to protest, but then his shoulders slumped utterly, and he gave a long, ragged sigh. "Yes, it is true. I altered the codicil. Brentwood discovered it. He threatened to ruin me. I could not bear it. Years of service, years of reputation. So I acted. I thought it simple, clean, but I had not reckoned with her." His eyes turned toward Miss Marple, full of a bitter, grudging respect. The arrest Crale rose. "That will do, sir." He signaled to the constable by the door. "Take Mr. Pritchard into custody." As the solicitor was led away, Mrs. Harroway sank back into her chair, a hand pressed to her forehead. "To think, the man we trusted." Colonel Deverell muttered something about damned disgraceful, while Lucy clung to Peter Ellison, relief flooding her face. Miss Marple's reflection when the others had dispersed. Inspector Crale lingered with Miss Marple. He looked at her with a mixture of admiration and irritation. "You see through them all, don't you, madam?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not through them, Inspector, merely through their little inconsistencies. Human nature, you know, is much the same everywhere. People always leave their mark, however careful they believe themselves to be." Crale shook his head. "Well, I'll say, this Scotland Yard could use eyes like yours." "Thank you," Miss Marple said mildly, resuming her knitting, "but I fear I should find London most fatiguing. St. Mary Mead provides quite enough excitement." Epilogue. In the weeks that followed, the village gradually returned to its tranquil rhythm. Mrs. Harroway, relieved of deceit, resolved to manage her estate with new determination. Colonel Deverell blustered about discipline and the decline of standards, though he was rather kinder to his servants thereafter. Lucy and Peter, emboldened by their exoneration, spoke of marriage, though Miss Marple wisely counselled patience. "Young love must be tested by time," she said. As for Miss Marple herself, she resumed her daily walks, her knitting always in hand, her eyes quietly observing the world. For though the matter of the cinnamon biscuits had been laid to rest, she knew well that crime, like weeds in a garden, always had a way of springing up anew, and when it did, she would be ready. The frost lingered well into December that year, painting the hedgerows with silver lace and turning the duck pond into a sheet of opaque glass. Life in St. Mary Mead, so easily unsettled by gossip and tragedy, had once more returned to its usual rhythm of small routines and gentle preoccupations. Yet beneath the tranquillity, echoes of the affair at Gossington Hall remained in the village shop. Whispers still circled as ladies bought their flour and barley sugar. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Larkin, would lower her voice whenever Mr. Pritchard's name was mentioned, and the butcher could not resist remarking, in his broad accent, "Never thought it'd be him always so tidy with his papers, that one." But to Miss Marple, who sat by her parlour fire with her knitting basket, the matter had long since been settled in her mind. Justice had taken its course, and what remained was not speculation but reflection. It was on one such frosty afternoon that Lucy Harroway called at Miss Marple's cottage. She was wrapped in a dark green coat with a fur collar, her cheeks pink from the cold. "I hope I'm not intruding, Miss Marple," she said shyly, stepping into the warm little parlour where tea things were already laid out. "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple replied, motioning to the hearthside chair. "I was just considering whether to begin a new pair of mittens or to finish an old scarf. Neither seems particularly urgent, which is the pleasantest state of affairs." Lucy smiled faintly, but her eyes held seriousness. "I wished to thank you again for everything. If not for you, Peter might have been suspected forever. And I," she faltered, then looked down at her gloved hands. Miss Marple poured tea into delicate china cups. "It is seldom wise to leave gratitude unsaid," she observed gently, "but I assure you, my dear, I required no thanks. It is enough to see you both free of shadows." Lucy hesitated. "Do you believe that people like Mr. Pritchard ever regret what they've done?" Miss Marple considered the question. "Sometimes, but more often, I think, they regret being found out. Greed, you see, blinds the conscience. It whispers that one deserves more than one has been given, and once that notion is entertained, honesty becomes a hindrance rather than a virtue." Lucy nodded slowly. "I shall remember that." They spoke for a while longer, of small matters, wedding plans tentatively made, the parish fete scheduled for spring, and when Lucy departed, she left a small bouquet of winter roses upon the table. The inspector's letter some days later, Miss Marple received a letter from Inspector Crail. His handwriting was neat but forceful, every word stamped with authority. "Madam," it read, "I must once again acknowledge the value of your observations in the recent affair. Your deduction spared us endless confusion. Scotland Yard has concluded its case against Harold Pritchard, who will face trial in the new year. I can only say that if half my constables possessed your clarity, my work would be infinitely easier." Miss Marple folded the letter with a faint smile. It was a curious thing, she thought, to be praised by policemen. They valued procedure, evidence, and sworn testimonial very proper. Yet it was often the small things they overlooked, a tremor in a voice, a glance avoided, the curious matter of who eats which biscuit, and why. Such trifles, invisible to those trained to see only the grand design, were to her the most revealing threads of all. The winter's end, Christmas came, and with it the familiar warmth of village tradition. Carol singers clustered outside cottages, church bells rang bright and clear, and Mrs. Larkin, tireless as ever, organized a collection for the poor at Gossington Hall. Mrs. Harroway insisted on hosting a Christmas luncheon for the parish, determined to prove her hospitality had not been tainted by scandal. Colonel Deverell carved the turkey with military precision. Lucy and Peter exchanged shy smiles over the plum pudding, and for a brief moment harmony seemed restored. Yet Miss Marple, seated quietly at the far end of the table, knew that memory lingers long after festivities fade. The cinnamon biscuits had left their mark. No plate of spiced pastries would ever be offered in that household again without an unspoken shadow passing over the room. Miss Marple reflects on New Year's Eve. Miss Marple sat by her fire, listening to the distant chime of the church clock. Her knitting lay idle in her lap, for her mind had wandered down familiar paths of thought. How strange, she mused, that murder should so often arise not from hatred alone, but from the most ordinary of desires, greed, fear, ambition. One need not look too far in intrigue or dramatic vendettas. The seeds were planted in every village garden, waiting only for the right season to sprout. She recalled Pritchard's weary confession, his face collapsing under the weight of exposure. He had not resembled a villain from the pages of romance, but a tired, frightened man who had bartered integrity for comfort. That, Miss Marple reflected, was the true tragedy of crime, not the act itself, terrible though it might be, but the slow corrosion of character that led to it. At last, she rose and drew the curtains against the cold night. Tomorrow would bring a new year, with its own puzzles and sorrows, its small joys and unexpected turns, and in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, where gossip fluttered like sparrows, and life appeared so very ordinary, she knew there would always be secrets waiting to be uncovered. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes bright in the firelight. "Human nature," she murmured, "is the most fascinating of puzzles." Then, with a contented sigh, she extinguished the lamp and retired, ready to meet whatever mystery the world might send her next.